Gary Berlin, Managing Director with CIBC Atlantic Trust here in Atlanta. And I want to comment that I haven't been in this space since Invesco sold our company a few years ago, and it's great to be back. This is a beautiful place for this type of meeting. And I want to thank our co-host today, our company Atlantic Trust, and of course our venue host Invesco, and we're really privileged to be here. And as you'll note, this is an especially great venue on a pretty day, and I don't know that we could have better Chamber of Commerce weather than we have right now. So I want to welcome everybody. I want to appreciate your interest in the topic and your attendance and your fellowship in working with Sue and of course all of us who volunteered to keep this program moving. I had the privilege of knowing Neil for a number of years, and so sad that he's gone, but always appreciated his inquisitive nature. We have to think of questions that Neil might have asked, and of course we have one of those on the docket today. We'll get to our program in a few minutes after you've had lunch. So again, thanks to our hosts, thanks to you for being here. Let's enjoy lunch, and in a few minutes I'll introduce Ben Johnson and we'll start our program. Thank you. I want to introduce a couple of folks briefly who are a good part of the reason why we're up here. Charlie Brady over here is the founder of Invesco and had the foresight in around 1973 or 74 to set up the forerunner of this company, and I had the good fortune to work with Charlie and Invesco for about 15 years, and appreciate everything he did with Invesco, and including organizing a company that could be in this great space for us. So, Charlie, glad you're here. And I also want to note Sue Williams. Sue had the inspiration following her husband's death a few years ago to organize this program that has led to now, I lose track, 9 or 10 programs like this in the Southeast. We've had most of them in Atlanta, but we've been in Durham, we've been in Charlotte, and have ideas, we'll travel. And it's just been such a pleasure to work with Sue and other volunteers as we've developed these programs over time. Well, most of you know Ben Johnson, so I won't go into a long introduction. Suffice to say that Ben followed Neil. As Neil retired from Alston and Bird, Ben became the managing partner at Alston and Bird. And I think there must be some manipulation behind the scenes, because when Neil left Alston and Bird, he became general counsel here at Invesco. And now that Ben is retired from legal practice, he's chairman of the board of Invesco. So I won't look for any manipulation behind the scenes, but I think it's been a great association between the two companies. All of you know Ben is a guy who gets things done, and I'll just relate a quick anecdote, and Ben will come up and introduce our panel and lead the program. I gave Ben a call when I had volunteered with Sue to organize a program for today, and I asked if he would kind of handle a panel, be the interrogator for a panel on this subject, and we talked about the subject a little bit. He agreed to do it, about 3 or 4 days later, he calls me and he says, all right, I've got the panel. And I think that's just a great lesson for any of us in the room, that if you're charged with organizing a panel discussion, call Ben, ask him to lead the conversation, and then you can sit down like I'm going to do and just enjoy your lunch. So Ben, again, thank you everyone for being here.
Yes, if any of you have a program you would like me to put together for you, please call me up. I had a mentor early in life who was a federal judge named Griffin Bell, who later became Attorney General. And he was fond of saying to young lawyers, if you just give away your time, you'll never be unemployed. So that's sort of the story of my life. I would like to also second our thanks to Sue for organizing this effort now 5 years ago. And many of you have been to wonderful programs that have touched on different aspects of Neil's interest and involvement. Probably ought to also introduce Neil and Sue's granddaughter, Taylor, who's here. Taylor does not work at Invesco. She works at Goldman Sachs, but she's in the industry. So each of our panelists, with the exception of Suzanne, knew Neil. And we all know how much Neil would enjoy being on this program, because he was so interested in this as so many other topics, but this was particularly a topic that he found that he really wanted to wrap his arms around. And Neil was, as a lawyer, was a corporate governance expert who practiced corporate law for his entire practice career. At the time of his death, he chaired the board of IVR, which one of our panelists today now serves as chair of. That's Invesco's Real Estate Investment Trust. He was also the lead director of Acuity Brands, and he was on the board of PrintPack, one of Atlanta's most important private companies. And we could spend a lot of time talking about Neil and his many talents, but Mary has already alluded to the fact that one day Charlie Brady was driving his car and he saw Neil Williams out walking, and he thought to himself, Neil recently retired. And the next thing you know, Charlie had invited Neil to become the first general counsel of Invesco, which was the predecessor to Invesco. And without taking any of the glow away from Charlie, I think Charlie would acknowledge that Neil made a very, very lasting contribution to the building of what we now know as Invesco. And so now let's move to the panel. Let me I'm going to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order, if that's all right. And while I'm introducing them, I'm going to ask them to just come up and take one of these chairs up here. And I'm not going to, and I will continue to talk about some of our panelists' experience as we go through the program, so therefore I don't have to say everything up front. But when I was asked to put together a panel for this program, one of the first persons I would naturally think about is John Brown. Now, John Brown is, and he's going to be embarrassed, and so I need to keep this short and sweet, but he's a legend in American business. He started to work for a company called Stryker in 1977, when it was a small medical business with $17 million in sales. He took the company public in 1979. When he retired in 2009, the company hit $6.7 billion in revenue. And now it's got a market cap of $50 billion. And that's a pretty successful story. And when we get into some more of the discussion, we will talk about some of the ways he did that, approached that in the context of some of the questions we're going to talk about. He also served as the director of many other companies. Most recently, he was the lead director of St. Jude Medical, a cardiac medical device company based in St. Paul, which was recently acquired earlier this year by Abbott for $25 billion. And so, John, if you'll come up, and John's already mic'd up, but they're turning all our mics on remotely. At least we hope they are. Our second panelist is Kevin Carome. Now, why would I think of Kevin Carome when I think about the subject matter of today's program? Well, it's because every time I think about anything that relates to corporate governance, I think of Kevin. Kevin is the general counsel at Invesco. He is my primary liaison with Invesco and the management. And I well know that he relies on a lot of people like Rob Grigsby, who I also call if Kevin's not around. But Kevin is truly the expert, the go-to guy that I call on any question that relates to corporate governance. So Kevin, why don't you come up? And next alphabetically is Suzanne Christensen. And Suzanne has been at Invesco for 6 years. And before that, she had a distinguished career in the industry with Franklin Templeton. And her duties at Invesco include investor relations. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with investor relationships and how do you nurture those relationships and how do you take advantage of and build a successful investor base. So Suzanne, if you'll come up. And then last but certainly not least, but least alphabetically, is Jack Hardin. And Jack and I graduated from law school the same year. And he came to Atlanta and started practicing law with a major firm. And then shortly thereafter, he was one of the founders of the Atlanta law firm of Rogers Hardin. And I was wrestling with the last member of the panel because somebody suggested it would be great to have an academic who taught corporate governance on a daily basis. So I got a list of the top 2 or 3 academics who are specialists in corporate governance. And then once I had gotten everybody's choice as to who the best of those might be, I said, now if you had a choice between that person or Jack Hardin on corporate governance, who would you choose? And everybody said, we'd choose Jack Hardin. So I thought, why get an academic in here when you can get the real thing, Jack Hardin? And I said, every time I have a corporate governance question, I call Kevin. And one of the reasons I don't call Jack is I couldn't afford Jack. So Jack, come on up. Now, the way we intend to proceed is to have me ask questions and then have the panelists argue like they do on Hardball or any of those programs for a while. And after we are spent in terms of the argument, I'll ask another question. And once I'm spent in terms of all my questions, we'll ask you all for some questions. So every NeilAsked program is built around a question. And we all imagine, and we have an advisory committee that meets, and Barry's on the advisory committee, and Janine's on the advisory committee. And are there other people here who are on? Yep, okay, yep. So we'll talk about a program, and then we'll come up with a question. So the question is, can corporate boards successfully navigate the interest of shareholders, other stakeholders, and the public at large? Now, that question, of course, is intended to raise more questions than you can ask. But since that's our first question, we all recognize that corporate directors have fiduciary duties to the company and the company's shareholders. But what other duties do they have? Who are some of these other stakeholders? And what's the public at large got to do with this? And I'm going to start with Jack Hardin.
So, first, thank you for stating the duty as to the corporation. For many years, people have loosely talked about fiduciary duties to shareholders. And we've learned as the Delaware courts struggled with what happens to the duties of directors when a company becomes insolvent. We learned that the duties are really to the corporation. They can be enforced by the shareholders as the people with the principal economic interest. But unless you're in one of these alternative vehicles like a benefit corporation or a social purpose corporation such as Patagonia is, the law tells us that the principal duty of directors is to enhance the economic value of the company for the benefit of the shareholders. But that doesn't answer the question, because you cannot do that without taking into account the very important other constituencies that are associated with a business enterprise, such as customers. It's particularly true in a situation like Invesco, where you have fiduciary duties to your customers. But also to employees and to the environments in which you operate. So you cannot prosper in a long-term way without operating in a way that is positive in its impact on customers and employees as a part of your strategy and duty to enhance shareholder value. So I would say those are the three principal constituencies.
Anybody on, this doesn't sound like hardball yet, does it? Anybody on the panel want to add anything to that answer? If not, we'll move along to another question, which is the news has been full of horror stories lately. They come from, Volkswagen, Uber, Mylan, Wells Fargo. How can boards protect their companies from serious reputational damage? How does a corporate general counsel, Kevin Carome, ensure that the board is appropriately focused on issues of corporate governance and corporate risk management? And then how can they mitigate the damages once the issue comes to light?
Thank you very much, Ben. The general counsels normally are part of an executive management team. I think general counsels, by the way we're trained, and at least in my case, the way I'm wired, are probably good at looking at downside risk, and so can be of help to boards in thinking about the risks of an organization. Boards should expect the management teams that they've appointed to be able to articulate to them what management thinks the key risks are in any company. And of course, that's going to involve looking across the whole spectrum of the stakeholders, not just shareholders. and then regularly inform them. How does management track those risks? How does management measure them? And what is management doing? What is the company doing to mitigate those risks? Now, when I say risk mitigation, I'm not saying risk elimination, because you can't operate an organization in this world without taking risk. And things are going to go wrong. And so that gets into what do you do when you have a crisis? And in many cases, a crisis in the first instance is going to be a reputational problem for the organization. And once again, it's going to ripple across all the stakeholders that Jack has talked about. So my belief, and Ben, I think yours too, because you lead our board very well in it, is that boards should challenge management teams to think about what the next crisis might be. If you've done a good job identifying your risks, you can identify scenarios that are rooted in that risk assessment, and you can plan for them. You can do drills for what you will do if you have a particular type of problem. You can ask yourself questions like, who in the management team is going to need to lead this? What other constituents in the company are going to have to be part of the crisis response team? What outside resources would we need, advisors, other resources, and have we lined them up? So if the crisis begins on day one, we're ready to go on day one. An example of this that's frequently in the media reports these days is a cyber breach incident. I would think that just about any well-managed company, if it puts its top risks together, cyber problems are going to be, if not the top item on the list, very close to it. And what we believe is that companies need to prepare for a problem. Obviously, you need to do whatever you can do to hold the problem off, so you need to be defensive. But you need to be planning for a breach on a when, but not if basis. And that's what we seek to do here at Invesco.
Why don't you talk about some of those efforts that you have participated in at Invesco in the cybersecurity area?
So I think what you're referring to, Ben, is we think of the sorts of situations that fortunately to date, so far as we know, have not arisen but might arise. So a criminal enterprise or even a state actor gets into our systems, gets a hold of employee data, gets a hold of fund shareholder data. What would we do? Do we have the right resources aligned to respond to it? Do we have the right connections with law enforcement? Do we have communication plans on the shelf that we can pull out and tailor to the circumstances? And so we come up with scenarios of what a real life event could be, and we throw people in a room and we start practicing off of those scenarios. The first lesson you learn from it is that if the scenario is well conducted, you're not going to have enough information to be able to answer all the questions that all the stakeholders would have, which means, among other things, when you need to be balanced in making decisions, and sometimes in terms of what you communicate, less is going to be more. We could do a whole day on that topic, Ben, but I'm going to, in the interest of time and the other things we need to cover, I'm going to stop there.
Jack, John, Suzanne, anybody have any further comment on that question?
No, I think you did a really good job covering key components of how we think about it. You can never be entirely prepared for any particular incident or type of, but it's, to Kevin's point, it's about the rehearsal, it's about going through it and really developing the muscle memory as an organization about how you address that.
Well, as long as you have the floor, why don't I put the next question to you?
Yeah, may I just interject?
Sure.
I think that we have two current examples of maybe not being as prepared as possible for dealing with a crisis. Both the Securities and Exchange Commission and Equifax are in the news right now as a result of breaches. And one thing they're sharing in common is the delay between the time they found out about the problem and the time they made it public. And there's always a tension when there's a crisis. You want everything you say to be precisely accurate. And often when a problem first arises, there's a lot more that you don't know than you do know, and that becomes a heavy weight that sort of tends towards, well, let's not disclose it until we know more about it. But I think we're seeing in both of those two cases that the delay in disclosure has subjected both of those organizations to very intensive criticism.
I look out at the audience as I see Nancy, and I'm wondering about the role of internal audit and employee hotlines and things like that when you've got a reputational risk like you had at Volkswagen. How effective are employee hotlines or trust lines?
Is that a question to somebody on the panel?
Well, anybody on the panel who's got an opinion. If you don't have an opinion, don't answer the question.
So they are the standard part of the playbook of any well-organized control environment these days. What our experience shows is that, and I think this is fortunate, but it's factual, that 9 times out of 10, or maybe 99 times out of 100, it's either an employee issue or something other than what the control environment has been designed to deal with. It's one means of management being alerted to problems that are not in the forefront of their brain. What I'd say is if you have the right culture, if you have a good corporate culture where constituents, starting with employees in this context, feel free to speak up and raise problems, that's a far better defense than whistleblowing lines to identifying issues and addressing them. If your first line of defense was whistleblowing lines, something would be lacking in your culture and something else would be lacking in your control environment.
All right, let me put this question to Suzanne. An important and increasing phenomenon in our industry and in the whole area of wealth management has been the shift from active management to passive management. And by that, for those of you who don't understand immediately what that means, a mutual fund or just picking stocks at the stockbroker is active management, and having an index fund is passive management. There are lots of other ways you could describe it. But Suzanne, just using Invesco as an example, what percentage of Invesco shares are held by institutional investors? And then what percentage of those institutional shares are held in index funds, which just are the S&P 500 or some other ETF type product?
Sure. So Ben, thanks. So our shareholder base is about 83% institutional shareholders. And of those institutional shareholders, about 40% is what we consider to be passive. So it would include the ETFs and some quantitative strategies that we have. So clearly a big percentage of our shareholder base is what you would consider in that sort of passive category. As I think about it, though, how does that impact us, and how do I answer that in the context of the question about engaging with shareholders? As I reflected on the question, and I think more broadly about the industry, and obviously not unique to Invesco, because I think we've seen an unprecedented sort of $500 billion worth of assets going into passive in the last first part of this year, let alone. And I think I read a statistic that like 20% of the S&P, the shareholders of the S&P 500 are actually passive investors. So obviously a big percentage. But if you think about those investors in a company, they're not necessarily motivated by the same sort of traditional value types of motivators or decisions. They hold the stock because it's part of the index, it's a requirement, so they're not thinking about, hey, am I going to be in the company, am I not? They're going to think about things like, okay, well, if I have to be in, I'm going to be holding these shares, I need to make sure that it's a well-run company. I need to make sure that the management is focused on sustainable value. So they're thinking about the long-term things, which is actually, from my perspective in the chair that I sit, is kind of a welcome conversation rather than looking at shorter-term financials or things that are sort of quarter over quarter. The other thing that they're quite focused on, we found in our own experience at Invesco, is the ESG type criteria around a company, which is the environmental, the social, and the governance, which comes back to our topic of the corporate governance, and very focused on how those companies are run and looking at those ESG factors as a primary. And so we actually at Invesco have had some conversations with some of those passive investors, some of the larger shareholders that we have, that really get into those kinds of topics because they want to understand how the company is run.
And a lot of those investors who are long-term investors who are not going to sell, they can't sell because they've got to have all 500 stocks in the S&P in their index. And a lot of people who write in the area say, we need to quit worrying about short-term issues. There have even been discussion about eliminating earnings guidance, because what we want to do is to create long-term shareholder value and not engage in quarterly financial engineering. But now I want to ask this question to John Brown, and I'm going to give you a fact about his service with Stryker. During his tenure, he built Stryker into a Fortune 500 medical technology company by achieving earnings growth of 20% annually for over 20 years, 80 consecutive quarters of increasing earnings at an annual rate of 20%. So, John, what I'd like to ask you, how did you balance long-term versus short-term goals? And was that a long-term or a short-term objective?
I really just want to tell a little story and then we'll go from there. I was involved with Alex Brown, investment banking firm, and Smith Barney in getting ready for a roadshow in the spring of 1979. And one of the investment bankers turned to me and he said, Brown, he said, what are you going to tell these people why they should invest in this company? And I said, well, we're a growth company. And he said, well, what does that mean? And I went through this spiel and he said, no. A growth company is a company that has earnings of not less than 20% per year. My response was, well, that's what we're going to be. And of course, you can see my credibility with him now is zilch. Anyway, we had done it for 2 years in a row, 77, 78. I came back to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and met with my senior staff, and I said, we want to be called a growth company, and the only way we can do that is to commit to 20% growth. And they too threw dust in the air. Of course, they thought I'd lost my mind, but we did it. And we went from a company that was laughed at, and because we were from a funny place called Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we had this odd goal of growing earnings at not less than 20% per year. And this went on for about 3 or 4 years, and we went from being laughed at to respected. Then it kept going, and we went from being laughed at, respected, to feared, because we started gobbling up market share. And I would argue that the goal had more to do with Stryker's success than anything else. And I would argue that that's one of the problems with most of the businesses today is they don't have a clear target. As a result, they give ranges. Their earnings will be between so-and-so and so-and-so. Sales will be between so-and-so and so-and-so. Or if you have a specific target, there's no squirming, there's no way to get out of it. We published what our goal was. Our directors agreed with it, our employees agreed with it, and our competitors were scared of it. But the great thing about this was we didn't have an R&D budget. We just said you can spend whatever you have to. You can do it with internal growth, or you can do it with acquisitions, but you've got to have 20% earnings growth. And that had more to do with shaping Stryker than anything else that I had anything to do with. Now, we tended to operate with a few very simple mantras. One of them was invent it, make it, and sell it. Our code of conduct was very simple. Don't lie, don't steal, and don't cheat. So when you have mantras like that and a target of growing 20% per year, you attract a unique group of people. We tended to attract former military officers and athletes. They were good academically, but also good achievers, and knew how to compete. And I would argue that the simple goal of 20% profit growth year in and year out had more to do with setting Stryker's achievements over the years than anything else.
Well, that brings us to the subject of corporate strategy. I get a lot of, I started to say junk mail, but it's not junk to any of the people who send it to you. But this is from the National Association of Corporate Directors that came last week. And they do polls all year so they can sell services and that sort of thing. But it said 90% of directors say it's important to improve the board's involvement in strategy development in the next year. And it also says 73% of directors say there is not enough time during board meetings for strategy discussions. So I've got this question for Jack Hardin. We've talked a good bit earlier about compliance and risk management, but there are some serious students of corporate governance who are concerned that boards have become so absorbed in questions of compliance that they've lost their sight of their role in setting corporate strategy. What would you say about that?
Well, I think that's a tension that definitely exists. Some of it has to do with regulatory oversight and the way the marketplace has expectations of directors, but also it has something to do with our profession. Because the way we defend directors against charges of breach of duty are largely to demonstrate that they had effective and thorough processes. They got good advice and they relied on people whom they had no reasonable basis not to rely on. So in anticipation that in any transaction you engage in, you're likely to inspire a shareholder suit, lawyers focus on process. We want a record that we had good process. So when the claim is made, we know that if we make decisions independently without conflict, and we have good process, we should get the benefit of the doubt through something called the business judgment rule. So particularly since the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, by the way, which passed 98-2 in the United States Senate, and anything that passes 98-2 in the United States Senate probably was not the result of a lot of thorough, intensive thought. But in any event, I do think over time, directors are beginning to realize that process is driving out substance and struggling to do something about it. But it's not a digital thing. It's not, well, let's quit doing process and work on strategy, or let's not work on strategy because we've got to be in a position to defend ourselves. It takes a balance. In my view, the balance is shifting in a lot of the boards that I have visibility of. But it is a constant tension.
Now, in any program like this, you would like people to leave with having felt like they learned something that was hot and in. Now, if you read corporate governance materials, particularly in the last year or two, the guru of all gurus is Marty Lipton, and he coined the phrase, the new paradigm. So, Kevin, I want you to tell this group so when they leave today, they know what the new paradigm is, so they've got something hot and sexy that they can take away from this lunch.
Well, Thank you, Ben. And I think it goes to your first question, it touches on your first question about what are the constituents that boards need to worry about, and it touches on some of the other things that my fellow panelists have commented on. So I believe the essence of the phrase new paradigm of corporate governance that Mr. Lipton uses, it's an effort to push both boards of directors and institutional investors like us to take a long-term view with respect to how a company is governed and at the management level how it's managed. And in particular, to take the focus off of short-term financial results to shareholders. So as it's articulated, it's all about raising the status and the profile of the non-shareholder constituents. Now, with the disclosure that we are a client of Wachtell Lipton, so I think very highly of Wachtell Lipton. But I believe at its core, the articulation by Mr. Lipton is a reaction to activist hedge funds and the effort that many activist hedge funds are making to change management teams and adopt short-term programs at various public companies that would generate immediate returns for their funds. And I think what Mr. Lipton and others who've adopted this approach are doing is they're trying to give gumption to boards of directors to resist those efforts, and they're trying to put pressure on institutional shareholders not to become a fellow traveler with the activists. So what I believe is if there were no activist hedge funds out there, Wachtell Lipton would not have come up with the so-called new paradigm.
But I'd like to add that it's challenging, and while very welcome to hear that, perhaps the focus is going to be on long-term strategy and long-term investment to continue that and develop that sustainable value. I have a very recent experience of, how challenging that is, and that Invesco in their quarterly Q2 earnings announced that our expenses were trending a little higher and that our margin, we were going to have pressure on our incremental margins going forward. So where we had declared incremental operating margins of targets of 50 to 65%, that we were probably looking at 40 to 50%. And we're not entirely clear on the time frame for that. And so what happened then in the next month from July 31st to the end of August is we saw a share price decline, a pretty substantial 12%. It was about $36 down to about $32. It's now come back to about $34. But the point was, weren't really clear. There was this margin pressure, and so we had to double back and go and communicate more clearly that that was a shorter term on one hand, that we expected longer term to get back to those incremental margins, which are important, but also had to really clarify why, what was the pressure on that. And part of it had been this investment that we have made in a European ETF business that we announced that was at the time of acquisition was revenue neutral, so it was, but obviously dilutive to the operating margin. That was a good half of it. And then other parts were this investment that we've made in a robo-advisor, GemStep, that we've been very public about in terms of our investment. And then part of it was also some regulatory expenses and some regulatory pressure that we've been under, everybody, the data privacy rules and so forth. But my point in bringing this up is, while the idea is that you really want to be focused on the long-term sustainable, there's a lot of real-time pressure on making sure that the near-term financials are still sound. So it's a hard thing.
So Ben, I wonder whether it really is a new paradigm. And I think of it as a clever way to encapsulate a concept, which to me is not original, which is a well-advised management will stay in communication with its major shareholders and will explain to them what their strategies and goals are, so that at the time a crisis arises, they have an understanding base with their shareholders that gives them an opportunity to buy time.
Jack is reminding us that no new paradigm is really a new paradigm. Now, let me ask this question to John. There is an occasional debate among corporate governance experts about the importance of having non-executive chairman, and most people answer that by saying there's not much difference between a non-executive chairman and a lead director. John, you have been in the role, I think, of a CEO, have been in the role of a non-executive chairman, and you've been in the role of a lead director. How important is the relationship between the CEO and the lead director, or the non-executive chairman? And what kind of experiences did you have that where you found that important?
Well, the critical thing between the lead director and the CEO is confidentiality and respect. And I think all the great lead directors in this country have a very good relationship with their CEO. They trust each other. They keep each other informed of everything that's going on. One of the things, though, that just an asterisk here would be that one of the things I think you should look for in boards are boards that are invested in the company. Now, I don't mean stock options. I mean actually own the stock. So when the stock drops at the point, they're worried about it. And they think about it just like everybody else does. And to me, the director should have some equivalent of their annual compensation. Some number should be used to set the standard for their investments in the company. Investors, directors that are invested in their company will have a different perspective than those that just have stock options, for what it's worth.
Suzanne used the letters ESG a while ago. I'm sure everybody knows what ESG is. It's environmental, social, and governance. And then the other buzz acronym is CSR, corporate social responsibility. And we find increasingly, as Suzanne mentioned, ESG and CSR demands being made on public companies. And I guess I would like to ask Jack Hardin, where do you see all this going? And what do you consider the role of corporate directors in pushing or restraining social activism? When does a corporate board involve itself with issues like DACA and immigration and that sort of thing, environmental issues, and what is the appropriate line?
Well, I think these issues exist for a lot of reasons, but one of the most important ones is that corporations have assets and they're well organized. And so a person who has an issue that wants to advance that cause sees them as a logical person or entity to try to recruit to their cause. And corporations have to focus on what their main responsibilities are, but I'll hark back to what I said before. A company that acts with disregard for its effect on the communities in which it operates does so at its own peril. I think corporations have to understand what the expectations of society on them are and address those interests in a way that facilitates the corporation continuing to exist successfully in its marketplaces. So one thing that I've seen that's been particularly effective is a concept called purpose marketing, where corporations pick and choose among social issues and choose the ones that are aligned with their main activity. I mentioned to some of you in an earlier conversation, a corporation that's in the business of publishing various marks that have to do with helping renters find apartments. You could say it's in the business of putting people in housing, has aligned its social purposes and its employee engagement activities with the issue of homelessness, which is another effort to put people in housing. That corporation's CEO has a lot of issues that he's interested in. It's a matter of social justice, but he picks on the ones that are aligned with the overall purpose of the corporation. I think it's a balance. There will be no end of entreaties made to corporate leadership to use their resources and their influence to advance a cause, many of which are very good. But it has to be balanced against the main purpose for which the entity exists, which is to enhance shareholder value.
Just this morning, there was a news story that said that Don Loeb's Third Point Fund, which is an activist shareholder, a hedge fund, which has accumulated 1.3% ownership interest in Nestle, and Nestle announced that it had, quote, set a new profit margin target and that it would accelerate share buybacks amid pressure from activist investor Dan Loeb. That's their statement to the public. And obviously we've seen those sorts of demands by activist shareholders and companies as diverse as Procter & Gamble and Bristol Myers. Let's just assume hypothetically that you were representing Nestle, and they said, we just had a call from Dan Loeb who says he wants us to increase our projected profits and engage in more shareholder buybacks. What would you say? What's your playbook?
Well, when folks like Mr. Loeb, Mr. Ackman, Janus Partners, and others show up, the normal management response is sort of to retreat to a siege mentality. It's not usually the best response. I'm not saying there's never a situation when it's right. But I think you reach out to activist shareholders and you engage in conversation with them. In some sense, you know what they want, which is they want to precipitate a transaction or another activity that will increase the value of the position they've just taken. And the sooner you do it, the better, because they'll have a higher rate of return. But they can also present situations that can be diffused. I've had situations in which we put their representatives on the board to avoid proxy contests, but also to create a line of communication. And there are times where you may have no choice but to stiff arm someone in that environment because their interest might well be significantly contrary to the long-term interest of your shareholders. But I believe in giving communication a try.
When we were going through a telephone call about these questions, I said, when we got to this one, I said, it reminds me of a conversation I regularly have with my son and daughter-in-law who are in the restaurant business. I never knew what Yelp was until I started having kids who were in the restaurant business. So periodically late at night, I'm having a drink and I hit Yelp so I can see what they're saying about some restaurant or another. And then sometimes I will say to the kids, what'd you think about that? And they always say, you can't pay attention to Yelp people. And sometimes I say, you know, even jerks are sometimes right. And that's probably true in the shareholder context. Now we're getting close to, this is going to be the last question for the panel. And this is sort of, you know, candy. Public companies, particularly who've just gone through the proxy season, have spent a lot of time and paid a lot of attention to proxy advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis. And so the question is, what do you see as the benefits, if any, and the challenges that these proxy solicitation advisory firms present to corporate governance? Why don't we just start with John, we'll run through Suzanne, and then we'll open the floor up for questions.
My sense is that the proxy advising firms have declined in importance. They, too many of the institutions just use their recommendation and hit the X on the form. But they're not that close to the business, and they don't really understand it that well. They have good analytical approaches, but they don't really understand the way a business operates, I don't think. So I would not be totally dependent upon the proxy advisor firm.
Zach?
Well, I think my major criticism of them is that they're too mechanical. They have checklists of issues, and they don't really do serious analysis that goes to the heart of the total value of the board and the management strategies. I think some of these statistics that Suzanne gave us, you could say is a good thing, right? So if you're having an increasingly passive shareholder base, maybe that undercuts their influence. But I agree with John. I do think their influence is declining. I'm not sure what the reason is. Maybe because the quality of their analysis is subject to criticism.
I think it's giving up a little on the active participation and understanding, you know, what you're voting on and so forth. I agree with what you're saying, that some of these different perspectives now are probably making it less relevant, and the move to passive, as well as things like we were talking about the investor stewardship group and the 6 principles of the promote accountability is really, I think, counter to, not counter, but it's really more of a, hey, pay less attention to that, do your own homework. You know, there's some good principles to be followed there, and hopefully that becomes the case, because I think our own experience has been at Invesco that they haven't done enough homework, and we have had to kind of follow up on different topics at times to make sure that, you know, people really understand.
So since I can't help but being a contrarian, it would not, I'm no fan of the proxy advisory firms, and if they went away, it wouldn't impact our business really at all. But the diversity of the investment management industry is such that it includes a lot of very small shops, some of which grow to be larger shops, and some of which have people that can really pick stocks. They don't have the infrastructure that we have to vote proxies, and they need somebody like ISS or Glass Lewis, or they need the SEC to make clearer than they have that they don't have to worry about voting proxies, and they need their clients to buy into that. And without one of those two things, you need an ISS or Glass Lewis to keep the business healthy.
All right, now we've got, we have microphones. We have a microphone here. If anybody wants to ask the panel or a panelist a question, now's the time.
Hi, Howard Polewski. Do you all have any views as to how boards are constructed today and how that's changed over time in terms of either specific capabilities or specific skills or diversity, and how important is industry knowledge or industry experience as you're constructing your boards?
I'll take a shot on that. Over the few decades that I've been doing this, there's been a lot of changes in the way that boards have been constructed. Boards were largely white men when I began practicing law. And over time, boards have focused on diversity, and not just for social purposes, but because people have realized that a lot of value and strength comes from divergent viewpoints. You have to have diversity in the context of people who respect each other and will listen to each other. But I've found some of the most successful boards are the boards that have tried to have diversity of skill sets. So people with financial expertise, people with an understanding of the industry, people with CEO experience. Of course, every board reaches out for a retired accountant to chair their audit committee. But also people that come from different segments of their particular market, that understand their market. Sometimes that's marketing people, sometimes it's just somebody who happens to be look like the people the company's selling to. But I think those changes have happened, and I think they're good. I will say it's important to have a mix of skill sets, but every director should be somebody who's willing to work hard, has an open mind, is willing to learn, and is respectful of other people so that you can have an effective communication over differing points of view in a small room.
Thank you all for your comments, very interesting to me. And I just wondered if there's any part of the law of corporate governance that you think ought to be changed.
Judge, could you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
Maybe I need 2 microphones. Is there any part, any of you think, of the law of corporate governance that needs changing?
I think in general, the law, like the Constitution of the United States, it's not perfect, but it stood the test of time. If you ask me for what would be top on my wish list, it remains easy to attack a corporate transaction from the class action bar. I think it's true that most of those suits generate returns for the lawyers that bring them rather than the shareholders that they're intended to benefit, and it creates economic friction that I'm not sure adds societal value. However, there are bad transactions that are done, so just outlawing them would be a flawed approach as well. So I guess I've done the classic lawyer thing. I've given you on the one hand, on the other.
All right, I think we had 2 questions up here. Sue had a question. Raise your hand. Here we go.
My question has to do with how the corporations serve the public at large. It's kind of been addressed in a very general way, but maybe we could get some specifics about ways that you think that corporations can best influence and serve the public at large.
Well, let me take a stab at it. And you're probably not going to like this answer. It's probably like some of the panels we did on the role of lawyers. But responding to a need, and I'm talking about a commercial need, and commercial needs almost always relate to human needs. So let's take the example of Stryker, for instance. There are probably many people in this room who have joints that were made by Stryker, and it's probably a different world for those people than it was in 1973 when you first went to work at Stryker. That's responding to a real need, and it's doing so not to serve the public, but to respond to a real need. How many employees does Stryker have, John?
37,000.
37,000. And I assume you pay those people, right?
Pretty well.
And I assume they pay taxes.
A lot.
So I would start off by answering that question just the way I respond to people who want to know, why don't lawyers do good? When I say lawyers are doing good all day, every day. Now, some of them, you know, we have rogue lawyers. But my answer to that question is that corporations serve the public when they respond to a real need and when they employ real people and pay them real wages and let them pay taxes. Somebody else want to answer that question a different way?
I will say this, and I made this remark earlier. I think one of the roles that lawyers can bring to corporations is help, I use the phrase temple in the marketplace, help managements understand that it is in their long-term best interest to satisfy the expectations that society imposes upon them. If you run it long term against the expectations of society, you do it at your peril. I don't think it's the principal function of business to solve all the social problems in the world. I think our system assumes that businesses will be successful if they supply a continuing need in an effective way. But they need to do that in a way that society is not critical of because of the collateral consequences of their impact on the environment or their impact on social justice and other expectations that we as a society share. So I agree with what you say, but I think there are opportunities to make money for a period of time running against the expectations of society. But I believe if you do it long term, it'll have adverse consequences.
Yeah, I think we have a pharma executive who's getting ready to be sentenced for something like that, right?
Not for that, but he's been being sentenced for 2 other maldeeds, but he attracted the attention of the authorities by increasing the price of his product tenfold without any economic justification.
All right, we've got about 2 more minutes, and I see Taylor's hand up over here, so let's give her a mic, and this will be the last question.
I've been waiting all morning to ask this question. But thinking through some of the recent headlines, so think Wells Fargo, think Equifax, and then bringing that in a full circle to some of the panel's comments earlier about the importance of communication among boards and on management teams. When a crisis does inevitably come up for a company, how do boards and management teams, or how can boards and management teams balance their need and their desire to know all of the facts of that crisis before going to the public versus sort of their duty to their shareholders and to the people that were affected to tell them early that something's happened? I think you all mentioned earlier that one of the big issues for both Equifax and Wells Fargo was the delay between finding out what happened and then going to the public. But you also said that there's need to be balanced in your communication and to understand the problem. So how do you balance those 2 interests? First question. Second question would be, are there, or is there a teachable moment for the next company that goes through this kind of crisis? What have we learned from some of these big data breaches or some of the account issues at Wells Fargo as far as the management and the reporting of a crisis to the public?
I think that was the crisis management plan. We put a lot of thought.
I'll say a couple things. The first is that people will do what you economically motivate them to do. And so if you economically motivate them to sell products behind your customer's back, they're probably going to do that. So having a strong culture, a sense of right and wrong, that is ethics, and a sense that it really is okay to speak up when something is wrong or someone is doing wrong is a way you prevent it. In terms of communicating, it's got to be very, very fact specific. I don't often read about things that I know 100% of the facts on in the financial press, but whenever I do, they never get it completely right. So are all the facts on Equifax or Wells Fargo out there? Probably not. So I try to bring a sense of humility to answering the question, but I think you've got to balance not giving an answer that raises more questions than it answers, and you're not able to answer the next round of logical questions, against being entirely truthful and not creating, I hate this word, but spin, where you're trying to get away with saying some incomplete version of the facts that you know are factual because you're afraid that the complete version won't go down very well. And so that's a real tight rope that people need to walk. And early on, less may be more. And I'll stop, I know we're done, so I'll stop in just a minute. The situation that gets cited, and it's in the cyber field, as the best example heretofore is JP Morgan. and what they did. And they said, they actually didn't do it right away. But before it otherwise became public, they said, we've had a breach. This is what we know about it. It's very widespread. We don't think nobody lost money, and we don't think it got into things like Social Security numbers, which they thought was true. And when we know more, we'll tell you more. And it was sort of short, simple, those bullet points, and it appears to be 100% truthful. And when people think of PR disasters in the cyber area, they don't think of JP Morgan.
All right, I want to thank our panel for being with us today and for what I hope was an interesting conversation. And I'd like to thank all of you all for being here. And so I think you can go get your car.
Thanks to Ben and our panelists, Sue, everyone. Hope you have a great afternoon, and love being with you for these couple of hours. Bye now.